Joining me to discuss the challenges facing managing Idaho's deer population is Idaho Fish and Game Director Ed Schriever. Thank you so much for joining me today. We know that the state detected chronic wasting disease in 2 Idaho mule deer in October. Can you give me a rundown of what this disease is and how it affects the animals?
Certainly, thanks, and thanks for the opportunity. The public's very concerned about the detection of CWD. Let me first start with what it's not, because we've had a significant disease issue in white-tailed deer in north central Idaho this year, and that is Epizootic hemorrhagic disease, and that is a very acute disease. It's a virus. It's carried by gnats. We've had it numerous times. This is the second worst mortality we've experienced. Literally thousands of deer, white-tailed deer, have died as a result of this very acute. They hemorrhage inside their lungs. If they get it, many of them die. Some recover, but they die very quickly within a period of a couple weeks. And we've been working in those communities to dispose of many, many, many dead deer. There are many more in the hinterlands that they just die, and people are running into them. So that is a significant issue, and that has had a significant effect on white-tailed deer numbers in the Cwd, Grangeville area. But that is not CWD, and CWD is not killing thousands of deer in Idaho, and I think it's important that the public be able to recognize the differences. EHD is having a population level effect in the localized areas where is it occurring. CWD, on the other hand, is a very chronic long-term disease, and it is not a virus, it's not a bacteria, it's a prion disease, and it causes proteins in the central nervous system in the brain to fold. It literally takes years for it to manifest itself in an animal such that they start to show clinical symptoms. Lethargy, their head droops, they slobber, they stagger. Many, many deer in the wild die before they actually die. If you held these deer in a pen someplace, they would all die of this disease. But when you're living in the wild and you're off your game and you're not feeding well, you might more likely die of malnutrition before you actually would die of the chronic wasting disease itself. But we do not have CWD manifesting itself as a disease. We have detected it in 2 animals. It's alarming. We never had it before. So we're right now trying to figure out to what extent we do have it. We literally found the needle in the haystack, and now we want to know.
Yeah, and I'm curious because you have one disease that has burned hot and fast and killed hundreds, more than 1,000 deer, yes. Thousands of deer in the Idaho County area. That's a disease that moves very, very quickly through a population until it doesn't have any more deer, any more bodies to run through. CWD, from what I understand, has a very long incubation period. And one thing that I've learned from covering COVID for almost 2 years now is just because you haven't detected it doesn't mean it's not there. So you found this needle in the haystack. Is it possible that it's more widespread outside of that Idaho County area in which you found it?
So anything's possible, but I'm going to say it's not probable. So there's a couple ways that CWD gets spread. One is by an infected animal who moves from point A to point B and takes the disease with them. Another way is through human involvement in one way or another, either moving infected animals that are wild or domestic deer farm, something like that, or a hunter goes to a state with CWD, harvests an animal, brings that animal back, butchers it, and then disposes of the spine and the brain, and those prions then are in the soil and they're ready to be taken up by other animals. So it can spread a multitude of ways. We are a bit surprised to find our first positive sample in Unit 14 on the west side of the state when we know we have it to the south in Utah and to the east in Wyoming and Montana. So
and
this
it's
is
been
kind
in
of
Wyoming and Montana for a number of years
well,
now.
it's been in Wyoming for decades. It's relatively newly discovered in Montana.
So, I'm thinking about where you found it. And for people who don't know, Unit 14 is in Idaho County, kind of between that New Meadows Whitebird area, right?
So between Riggins and Grangeville.
Got it. And so you talked about hunters going to these states in which it's been detected already, potentially bringing it back. Is there any risk to humans? Is there any risk to the hunters who are harvesting these animals?
Yeah, first, the commission and the legislature passed some rules 3 years ago that does not allow the importation of deer, whole deer from infected states. You can bring bone meat back, and so we're trying to deal with the risk of the people factor of CWD with rules and regulations. So your question, does it present a risk to people, right? I think for all intents and purposes, people can't get CWD. And there are similar types of diseases that affect...
Mad cow disease.
Mad cow disease is the one that affects cows. But CWD in deer cannot be transmitted to cattle and turn into mad cow disease. It is unique to the cervid family. Deer, white-tailed deer, mule deer, elk, and moose are the species in this state that are susceptible to CWD.
With that,
Scrapie is the same disease in sheep. They're different diseases and they're not transmittable or transferable. And the human version, Jakob Crutchfeld, is not CWD. There is some concern. We are not public health people at Fish and Game. There is concern by the CDC that provide instructions to people. If you kill a deer and it tests positive, you probably shouldn't eat the meat. But that's a CDC recommendation, not an Idaho Fish and Game recommendation.
Should people eat the meat if a test is pending?
I think, so when we respond and we now have a CWD positive and we are defining a CWD management zone, our recommendation is if you kill a deer in that CWD management zone, that you can butcher it and you can cut it and you can wrap it and you can put it in your freezer. But we probably would recommend you wait until the result of the test from that animal come back to make a decision on what you're going to do with the meat.
Now let's talk about that management plan and the surveillance hunts for a little bit. And so for this zone, what are you doing to see how prevalent this disease might be?
Exactly. So after, there's a lot of folks who are wondering what we're doing, and I would just point you to idfg.idaho/CWD, and you can go to our Cwd response plan that we've had for a decade. We've been tabletopping it with other agencies. What do you do when you find it? So we know we have it in 2 deer. We immediately started collecting more samples. We opened up check stations. We had our employees collecting all the samples we could from deer and elk that were being harvested in open seasons. And we literally got hundreds of additional samples. But we want to know, is it just this one place in Unit 14? So we established a surveillance area that is larger. It includes the south half of Unit 11A, some of Unit 13, some of Unit 18, some of Unit 23. We just drew a bigger circle. And we know we need minimum sample sizes from does and bucks of both whitetail and mule deer. And we subtracted those animals that came from open hunting seasons from what we need in the sample, and we determined how many more we need to get, and we established these surveillance hunts to use hunters as the method to collect the samples. You can only sample for CWD from dead animals. There is no test to swab up the nose or anything else to see if a living animal is CWD positive. So unfortunately, you need a dead animal to remove the lymph node and test for it.
So when when hunters, bring an animal, well, let's start at the beginning. If a hunter goes to that surveillance area, they harvest a deer, what do they do?
So all of these hunts have very specific instructions. When we issued these tags, they could only be bought at a Fish and Game office so that we could make sure you had the complete set of instructions on what you were to do. You are not to bring the whole deer out. You take the meat off, but you bring us the head. And we will sample the lymph nodes from the head. We have check stations set up in the field, or you can bring it to a regional office and we will take the head. If it's a buck deer, we'll give you the antlers after we bleach the skull, and then we will dispose of the head properly. But you leave the spine where you harvested the animal. Very specific instructions, mandatory. Every deer taken in these surveillance hunts must be brought in so we can take a sample from it. That's the entire purpose of the hunt.
So that lymph node that free lymph node extraction happens in the field. Does the state have the ability to test in Idaho, or are you sending those samples elsewhere?
We are sending those samples to Colorado State University, one of the biggest labs. The positive samples that we got back, we sent also to Ames, Iowa to have a confirmatory test, but those are being done. There is a lag time. They do a lot of testing. So we have heard back. So we already have looked at over 330 samples from the surveillance area after the two positives. I think we have about 68 samples pending, and obviously we'll have more samples coming in as a result of these hunts. So 300 some additional samples in the surveillance area, all negative. But this will help us determine. The Commission has established the Cwd Management Zone in Unit 14 and 15, and that means if in the future you kill a deer there on an open hunt, you can't take the head out, you can't take the spine out. Is that the appropriate area to manage that? So that's what this surveillance will help us determine. And it will provide the information for the next discussion about what will we do to manage. You can't get rid of it, but you manage the risk of spread and you manage the prevalence on the landscape. And those will be discussions based on the information we gather that the Commission will have with the public. That's not a predetermined outcome.
When we're talking about the Fish and Game Commission having those discussions with the public, can you give us an idea of what some of those policy decisions or changes might be for long-term management, and how might they interface with the local jurisdictions?
So it's generally accepted. It's different. So in Wyoming, they have deer populations that have prevalence in excess of 25% of the population is walking around with CWD. You might want to manage for a low prevalence, and to do that, it's a certain path where you really put high harvest rates on these deer populations, and you really limit, the number of old animals in the population. That's a discussion you need to have, because you will lower the deer population as a result of that management action to reduce the risk that it spreads elsewhere. And that's a choice, and people need to be engaged in the discussion about that choice.
We have about half a minute left as we're approaching those discussions. Are you confident that Idaho's hunting industry is going to be healthy moving forward with these challenges and these diseases that are present?
Yes. This CWD would take a long time to manifest itself at a population scale. It's about the risk, and it's about having people informed. But we are not going to be losing thousands and thousands of animals in the near term.
We're going to have to leave it there. Thank you so much, and thanks for watching. We'll see you next week.